Greetings, everyone. I am Joanne Barefoot. I am CEO and co-founder of AIR, the Alliance for Innovative Regulation, which is a nonprofit working to advance the goal of fair finance through technology. When I was young, the civil rights movement was young too, and so was the women's movement. And I went to Washington right out of college, very optimistic, and was there as wave after wave of laws and regulations passed. And if someone had told me in, say, 1970, that a half century later, in 2020, we would still have police brutally killing men and women of color, and we would have had a few years earlier the Me Too movement and discovered that reputable organizations were tolerating and enabling the mistreatment and harassment of women, I wouldn't have believed it. It would have seemed impossible to me. And yet here we are. We know that it takes more than laws and regulations to fix problems like these. As we think about last year, I think most of us hope that it was a turning point, believe it was a turning point or want to believe it, that the killing of George Floyd made people all over the United States and all over the world say, enough, we have to change this. We need to do something differently. I think it galvanized a new will to try to do better. And then the question becomes, if there's a will to do better, is there a way to do better? What are the techniques that we can use? Again, it's not just rules. It's matters of changing cultures and structures and unconscious biases and assumptions and blind spots of all kinds. And so we ask ourselves, what can we actually do? And then we ask ourselves, where should we start? And I think the best place to start is in the tech world. Technology is the issue of our age. It is changing every facet of how we live, from our work and learning to what we eat, to how we wage war, even everything is being changed by technology. And if we could fix the diversity problems in the tech sector, it could help permeate the rest of the world. It would take time, but then again, tech moves fast, doesn't it? Maybe it would be faster than we think. So we're going to talk today about how to do that, how to diversify the technology sector, which we know has a great challenge ahead in this department. And there's no one that I would rather talk with about this than my conversation partner today, Clev Mesidor. Clev is the founder of Logos, the National Policy Network of Women in Color in Blockchain, and is also someone who has been focused for all her career on reading and speaking and actually problem solving on these issues. So Clev, I'm so thrilled to be talking with you today.
Thank you. I'm excited about the conversation.
Me too. So let's start with the basics. We know that the tech industry has a big diversity problem. How would you describe it? And how do you even define inclusion when we think about this?
Yeah, I think that's an important place to start, right? Is how do we define inclusion? You started by talking about, your time in this movement, about gender equity and racial equity, and everybody's struck that here we are, how many years later still talking about this issue. There are some bright spots. We heard last week that the Black Lives Movement has been nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize. That's a step forward. But I do think that as we've moved forward, one of the challenges is, how do we define diversity and how do we define inclusion? Because that actually is a good starting point, because that means so many things to so many people. So if we're going to have results, we have to come together in terms of what is that baseline. And for me, when you look at everything from, gender, race, age, differently abled, so many, diversity points, LGBTQ, so many areas we should be focusing on. But I also think that America has changed, our marketplace has changed. So first and foremost, we should strive to reflect the diversity of America, right? We know that right now about close to 40% of this nation is, well, actually over, is people of color, right? And that is on track to grow. So we need to check ourselves when we fall, when companies or even institutions fall so far below that baseline. And then also, you know, we can't scapegoat some groups and pin them against the other, right? That's that blind spot. And I think you referenced that in your opening remarks, right? Because diversity inclusion, racial diversity includes Asian Americans, Black Americans, Latinx Americans, as well as LGBTQ Americans. So we want to make sure we're targeting those. But I think what we've seen in tech is the fact that there is diversity when it comes to Asian Americans, right? And even, you know, the few women that there are, you may have Caucasian women, but there's a blind spot when it comes to Black and Latino, Latinx communities in tech. And that actually is a misrepresentation of what the marketplace looks like.
And we know that this is a moral imperative and a matter of basic fairness and having a just society of opportunity. And we also know it's a business imperative too, that increasingly, as you just said, the customer will be diverse no matter what it is that your market is, and will also be younger and probably more attuned to concerns about these issues. So what are the strategies? What are the first strategies that the tech sector companies should think about applying? And why don't we divide between race and gender, because they may not be identical?
Yes. So you're absolutely right. It's a moral imperative and a business imperative. It's the right thing to do, right? Because it's about humanity, and it's about respecting the humanity of fellow Americans, or fellow workers. And in tech, you know, it is really about, you know, the humanity of, you know, the diversity of the tech ecosystem. Where do we start? You know, I do think for me, the most important place to start, which probably goes against what we've been trying to do for the last decade or so, there has been this, how can we get, you know, more Black and brown people in leadership positions, right? And then you have a company hire maybe a VP or even a president. But that doesn't solve the problem, right? Nobody wants to be the only woman or the only male in that boardroom. So we have to start back to the basics, internships and entry-level positions, because that's where a lot of tech companies are failing, right? There are challenges for people of color to getting internships. Oftentimes they require travel. Oftentimes, you know, these candidates don't have the income. But also, you know, even if they land the internship, are they getting the entry-level positions? So if we want to make sure middle management and executives are more diverse, we have to start with our internships and our entry-level positions. And I think that goes for gender and race. But I also think for gender, we have to be more cognitive of the ways that we engage, you know, and this is not different than race, but I think more mentorship programs. You know, one thing that studies show, which we don't like to admit, that, you know, women do learn differently than men. It's not a cognitive change, right? Our brains are not different. It's just the environment we tend to prosper in. You know, that's why women's colleges still exist, and there's an environment where women feel safer and feel more empowered, rewarded, and embraced. So, you know, so those mentorship programs when it comes to gender diversity are important.
When we think about the missing links in the recruitment chain, one of the things you and I have talked about before is the ineffectiveness of recruiting it from historical Black colleges and universities, where there has been maybe some show of effort, but not the results that we would hope for. How do you analyze that?
Yeah, it's one of the places where we've had progress, but not in the ways we want. And it's interesting, maybe 10 years ago, I was working in a organization, and there was a woman who focused on, choice and how the treatment of women and rape on college campuses was one of the things she focused on. And I remember her saying that on college campuses, there's been a lot of inroads, right? A lot of progress, right? More security on campus for women, more programs, more initiatives, but the rate of rapes on campuses had not changed. So you can actually have progress, but not change the actual thing that you needed to change. And I think it's similar to, what we see in college campuses and recruiting. I think the universities, HBCUs, other universities that have large students of color, have done their part in terms of training the next generation of engineers, innovators, developers, right? But they're still not finding jobs. And these schools have formed partnerships with tech companies and made themselves available for recruiting. But for some reason, these companies are still not hiring from those recruitment opportunities. And there's a lot of data that talks about some of the reasons why, the bias, implicit bias that's in place. And so we have to do better. One of the biggest examples that's in the news right now, is the Google example, right? There was the issue with the artificial intelligence experts, a Black researcher who felt she was pushed out. And she felt it was because of the research that she was doing about, the racial profiling in artificial intelligence. And to Google's credit, they have created partnerships with HBCUs and colleges. So you have the CEO now, going to college campuses and re-emphasizing too. I'm a Howard University grad, and
that is our vice president.
Yes. And our president is talking to Google CEOs as well, because universities want to make sure that when we actually do, get folks hired, that they're in an environment where they will thrive. But the Google issue places another problem, right? Because innovation is wonderful, but we know where the bias comes in is, real people, human beings are still creating them. And we have to make sure that we're monitoring and catching these biases. And so even the forced departure of Timnit Juru, I'm probably butchering her name, makes us, and I know members of Congress who actually wrote to Google, makes the alignment to how do we address these issues of biases in tech if things like this are happening. I think, going back to college universities, I think, we've made a lot of inroads, but I think we need to start monitoring colleges and looking at the data of the recruitment that they do on campuses and how much they're hiring, and try to figure out what's the deal. We know some of this data shows that the bias still exists, that people do see, HBCUs in the case of, Black student outreach as inferior, right? They hold, Black students to a different standard, right? And we're not going to fix these things overnight, but we have to start acknowledging them and addressing them.
Yeah, you touched on something I was going to ask. That you mentioned implicit bias, and there is an implicit race and gender bias, but there also seems to be a bias about the universities themselves and a bias toward expecting Ivy League or Stanford grads, or the people coming from the schools that some of these recruiters came from. And they really are going to have to recognize that that does not equate to merit when there are so many people who have great talent who, for whatever set of reasons, haven't been able to make their way into those traditional pipeline schools.
Yeah, I think there are women watching who are thinking, I've experienced this, that I'm held to a higher standard. And it's women across the board, regardless of your race, right? That we're held to a higher standard, a different standard. And when you add to that this issue of the two Americas we've talked about, and again, in your opening, you talked about how COVID, shut down the nation and forced us to actually face some of these issues. But the reality is we do live in two Americas. And part of that is HBCUs fit into this America that a lot of these institutions or employers may not be familiar with. So when you're used to recruiting at Harvard or Brown or Stanford, right? When you go to an HBCU, you've never may or not have never heard of. Even some people, I'm surprised, have never heard of Howard University. But you start questioning the curriculum, and we're past that, right? We know that there's no reason we should be questioning the curriculum. These schools have enough partnerships with industry to ensure that the curriculum is actually up to standard.
So you've sort of answered this, but I still want to ask it to you directly. One of the things we hear all the time from tech companies is saying we would love to hire more women or people of color as engineers in our product departments, but the pipeline's not there. That you have to start by teaching STEM to the little children and then wait for 20 years before you start getting the talent that you need. What do you say to that?
Yeah, I say to that, we've heard that before, right? 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 20 years ago. And we course corrected for that. We made sure the pipeline was correct. I remember when I worked in the Obama administration as a political appointee, that was one of the things that President Obama focused on. And he actually focused on community colleges. How do we ensure that folks who are not going to a four-year institution, who don't want to go to a four-year institution, that they're getting a quality education even at the community college level? So I do think that, this excuse that we can't find candidates is old and is incorrect, but a lot of people have it, right? Most famously recently, Wells Fargo CEO said this and faced the backlash, right? But I've heard this in even settings where, where people should know better, right? And so the issue is we have to break out of our silos. So we have to, check ourselves, right? And say, every time we think we can't find candidates, we can't find women, we can't find, LGBTQ candidates, we can't find older candidates, the issue is ours, and it's not the burden of this group that they're not, qualified or they don't exist. We have to expand how we do recruitment, how we push the envelope. And we have to recognize that, for whatever reason, right, it's difficult. For whatever reason, we have to invest in it, and we have to keep doing it until we get it right.
You shared with me some data on the numbers of people who are graduating in the STEM sciences and are not finding jobs. So that should be a problem that can be fixed. It's not about decades of sowing seeds.
Yeah.
So let me turn to, we've been talking about how to recruit. Let's talk about how you retain talent. How do you make the workplace welcoming and inclusive? How do we make sure that everyone can thrive there? And again, it may be useful to talk distinguishing between gender and race on this one also. What are the secrets there?
Yeah, I still think about Sheryl Sandberg's Lean In when she talked about this issue of, why women leave the workplace, that the fact that a lot of times, we check ourselves out of the executive suite, we opt not to be the CEO, and there are a lot of challenges. And, so when it comes to gender, I think she addressed a lot of that. And even when you think about race as well, I think of Shirley Chisholm, the first, Black female senator, and I'm from the Caribbean, she was from the Caribbean. One of the things that Shirley Chisholm talked a lot about was, the challenges. And as you know, she was part of the women's movement and very active, but she talked about this whole race and gender for her. What was more challenging for her, being a Black woman or being a woman? And I think she ended that being a woman is definitely harder, but being both is very, very, very difficult, right? So, when you look at, gender and some of the issues that we face, we have to, there's a lot more work to be done.
Yeah, definitely. And what about on race? Are there specific strategies for retainment, do you think?
Yes, yes. So in terms of retention, one of the things that has been talked about that have been executed is we have to create a workplace that is, belonging and inclusion is one of the things that in tech a lot of companies want their workplace to be like. But I also think that for retention to take place is we have to get over this one and only, right? Whether it be for women or for on race or gender, right? Because what the data shows is when you're the only one in that environment, you're the only woman in the boardroom, or you're the only Black person, it's going to feel you're going to feel stigmatized, right? You're going to, and if you don't have mentorship programs with executives that you feel comfortable with, if we're talking about belonging, everybody has to feel like they belong, right? And it's similar to LGBTQ communities, we have, that's why we're having that whole bathroom conversation in the workplace. Like, so these things are key to retention. So it is, how do you create a workplace where people feel, humanized and valued and that they belong? Because if they don't, that's one of the biggest reasons why people leave the tech sector, people of color or LGBT communities. It's just not worth it to fight that fight and to keep fighting that fight. But also, in terms of retention, I do think that, we have to create opportunities. One of the things that happened last year was the board of directors challenge in terms of companies, committing to, adding more people of color, more Black people to their board of directors, which quite often are not diverse. But that's helpful as well, because I know some people who are in majority male environments, work environments, or women of color who is majority male, or, she may be the only executive of color, having those executives to mentor her, matters. And actually seeing people on their board actually helps with retention. So I would say that, creating an environment and checking yourself and admitting that sometimes the environment is not acceptable and sometimes we fail, and nobody's going to beat you up for failing. When Wells Fargo's CEO said that ridiculousness, of course, he got targeted, but it opened up a conversation for, his executives, his employees, to change the environment. And if we take it even to blockchain, I do think I hold them accountable, Coinbase. I do think that one of the problems with their issues with the workplace diversity is the fact that they never acknowledged that they had a problem. And I think if they actually can do that, they're going to find that there's a lot of people who want Coinbase to survive in the tech sector. They're one of the largest, they're actually the largest employer in blockchain. And we want, our HBCUs to end up going there, but it's important to make sure that environment is where these new innovators will thrive. And I don't want to single out Coinbase only, because when you look at, emerging tech like blockchain or even AI and robotics, these challenges exist. And these companies, when you're innovating, you don't have the time to think about these things, right? And I think, if we're talking about retention, one of the challenges for emerging tech like blockchain, like AI, like robotics, is the fact that, a lot of them have their innovators as their CEO, right? And that's great, because that person deserves to be at that helm. But just like we saw with Facebook, at some point, Mark Zuckerberg had to say, I need some help. And somebody who's more strategic, like Sheryl Sandberg, had to step in and say, let's figure this out, right? Because great innovators need great, administrators and managers to help them get it right and move things forward.
I actually want to talk about founders, but before we do that, you mentioned boards. Have you seen successful strategies of using what we might call good old-fashioned governance practices to elevate these issues to boards? I'm involved in a project now that's trying to create governance best practice regarding ethical AI, for example. And, should that be coming to the board Should there be people in charge of an issue like that or an issue like diversity? And should they be expected to make an annual report to the board, or does that end up amounting to window dressing that doesn't really get the job done?
No, I think that's an important conversation, right? Because we know, and if I'm understanding your question correctly, we know the role of the board, right? The board of directors is supposed to be there to help the CEO and the executives lead the company. And oftentimes they don't get into the weeds of these stories, in terms of these issues. But these issues affect the bottom line, right? So, and that's an important thing for the board. And oftentimes when things do go bad, right? We mentioned Wells Fargo, people want to start, holding the board accountable. So I do think that, that leaders of companies, especially CEOs, CFOs, need to start looking to their boards to help them solve some of these social problems, because again, they go at the heart of human rights. And, we said on the onset that there's a more imperative, but there's also a business imperative. And the business imperative is because the marketplace has changed. The marketplace is not just more diverse. Consumers now hold companies accountable for different things that they didn't before. Like they actually look at how how corporations are acting responsibly. And it's not just the environment, but also how they're treating their employees and how they're, treating humanity. So I do think for businesses that there needs to be leadership at all levels, including boards, need to figure this out and, try to figure out the governance piece.
Yeah, you're mentioning the consumer expecting differently, and it's certainly especially true of millennials and younger. There's so much data showing that they really have elevated these kinds of issues in their buying choices, and companies that don't get that they're going to feel it for sure, since the millennials are the largest generation ever. So let's talk about founders. You touched on this, and I have worried for years that the tech world is dominated by founders. You and I both work at the intersection of tech and finance. We work with fintech in particular, and you step back from that and you say, well, finance has always been white and male dominated, and so has the tech world, and the financial world is old. The tech world as we know it, the Silicon Valley tech world, is young, but it developed the exact same pattern: male founders, and those are the stars of the industry. They're the ones everyone looks to. So how do we diversify founders? Is it both a supply and demand problem? How do we get VCs to find the good, diverse startups, concepts? Talk about that.
Yeah, so that's an important conversation. And so when we think of founders, right, and we think of startups, right, even entrepreneurs, we think of tech, right, because that is where that ecosystem exists. But I like to think of them as micro enterprises. I like to think of them as the small businesses. When I worked in Washington, small business is the engine of the American economy, right? So these micro enterprises, they hire one, maybe five, or almost less than 10 people. Right? These founders, oftentimes they themselves are independent contractors, but they are actually the businesses that will scale. So we need to create more opportunities for them to have access to capital, and crowdfunding is one of them. Right? So before South by Southwest, I hosted a national briefing of women of color in blockchain to commemorate Women's History Month. And the focus was that small business is the engine of the crypto economy, because as the Biden administration and this new Congress is looking at economic recovery and they're focused on small businesses, what they have in mind can't just be brick and mortar companies and mom and pops, because even brick and mortar companies and mom and pops are innovating, or leveraging technology, or finding ways to become virtual or digitize their services. So taking it back to tech and founders, right? If we look at them, if we look at these micro enterprises as small businesses, as critical to the larger American economy, we have to make sure that they have greater access to funding, because the fact that they exist in tech, people think they should get VC funding. Oftentimes VCs, they're not going to generate an immediate return that today's VCs want, right? So they go to crowdfunding, but there's not enough crowdfunding opportunities. During COVID, the PPP loan program was one of the responses, but we know that it failed to actually reach the gig economy, these startups and founders and entrepreneurs, independent contractors. So we have to do better over the next 2 years, the next 4 years, to make sure that we are, as a nation, and not just the federal government, but states also, and cities and mayors, we're actually making sure that there are greater programs for these new enterprises to thrive. And we have to make sure that traditional funding streams also can make room for these new micro enterprises, because they don't fit that traditional mold, but they are the engine of America's economy.
I remember when I first met you and you introduced yourself, or someone introduced you as the head of women of color in blockchain. And that seemed like the coolest combination I could imagine. Tell us about that. Tell us about your group.
Yes. Women of color in blockchain is actually the fastest growing demographic in the blockchain ecosystem. Right? We know that crypto is in its infancy, so the space is still growing and building. And certainly we have some unicorns, right? We have Coinbase, as I mentioned. There's Gemini. There's Ripple. There's all of these companies, Binance US, that are doing great things. But when you look at the ecosystem, who's building the products and services? When you look at the ecosystem regionally across America, in the Midwest, in the East, on the East Coast, on the West Coast, in the Southeast, what's happening in Miami, in Chicago, in Ohio, in Detroit, in Atlanta, are these entrepreneurs of color, women of color, who are building micro enterprises. And so for me, my organization is really about putting a spotlight on them. One of the issues on Capitol Hill for the Tri-Caucus, the Black Caucus, Hispanic Caucus, and the Asian Caucus, is the fact that they look at blockchain through the lens of implicit use of Bitcoin, right? And there is that, we're not going to deny that, but the blockchain industry is responding to that. But how do you make sure that these members, who represent such a large part of the US, see people who look like them, in the space? Because that's the only way that, as they legislate, as they, regulate, they will have these micro enterprises in mind. So in 2019 was our first delegation of women of color, geographically diverse, that we brought to Capitol Hill. And so this year, for Women's History Month, we kicked off Women's History Month with a delegation of close to 100 women of color. And we had sessions with the Small Business Administration, with Lab CFTC, with the Department of Commerce, to make sure that these agencies see the women of color who are building, and also have an opportunity to share their services, and let these micro enterprises know what's available to them as they scale and they build, and they are looking for access to capital.
That's fantastic. Can you point to some concrete examples of success stories? I know you have worked on the ground with a lot of companies that are trying to diversify. Could you share one or two examples and tell us how they did it? What was the secret to success if they succeeded in getting where they wanted to go?
Well, I would say is, how do we measure success, right? And we have to be strategic, and we have to be, tempered in terms of defining success, right? So I think of during, the Trump administration, and there was a crackdown on diversity and inclusion programs, right? And big tech companies got a notice saying, we're going to be cracking down on how because these large companies are federal contractors as well. They actually got a notice to, that there's some concerns. And I remember Microsoft standing up and saying, we got one of these letters and we're committed to, diversifying our workforce, and that won't stop. And so is Microsoft perfect? But in that case, though, a large federal contractor, it was a success that they stood up, against, the federal government and said, no, this is actually important. And I mentioned the Board of Directors Challenge from last year. I think over 40, companies took that challenge, and some of them were tech companies as well. And that's actually very encouraging. And, I work in the blockchain and cryptocurrency space, and we have a few successes there. I have to give, props to Ripple. Ripple was one of the first, blockchain exchanges to actually create a university program, I think 3 years ago. And when they launched it, they included an HBCU, Morgan State University, which was incredible. And they've invested in it. And today they continue to invest in Morgan State. And Morgan State is thriving. As a Howard graduate, Morgan State is even doing better than we are in terms of the blockchain space. But that is because of industry leaders as well. And I think, Ripple even committed to adding, a person of color in their board as part of that board challenge. So is Ripple perfect? No, but they're taking steps, and those were important steps. And also Binance, right? And I talk about Binance Global. One of the things that we've seen them do across the nation is actually invest. When you look at the successes that have happened in the Bermuda, the Bahamas, and Barbados in terms of their regulatory sandbox, in terms of the ecosystems that they've created, Binance has actually been a big partner there in terms of making sure that they're supporting that ecosystem. And also, there's examples. One of them is, one of their executives, Yele Badesimo, when he left, he's on the continent of Africa. When he left, he started his own company, Bundle, and Binance funded it, and it's actually thriving. So, and we have some other examples as well. I do think that, blockchain and cryptocurrency companies are committed to, fostering that ecosystem. I think many of them want to build the developer community and, focus on Bitcoin, but it's nice to see when, because that's going to traditional tech, right? You're going to the same developers. So I think in the case of Binance and Ripple in this case, they stepped that out of the box, right? They said, how do we do this differently, and how do we invest differently?
After all, they're innovative companies. They can invent new models for more than products and payments channels and so on. You mentioned Women's History Month, and we are now in Black History Month. Tell me how you're thinking about what's ahead. Are you optimistic? Do you think we will look back on 2020 and say it was a turning point and we did better after that? I'd love to hear if you've got role models among women or people of color that have inspired you along the way and help you think about where we are in the arc of history and what might be ahead.
Yes, the arc of history. 2020 definitely shifted that arc, right? There was a lot of tragedy in 2020. We lost so many people to COVID, but there was a lot of optimism as well. I think, we started talking more about race. We started talking more about, gender inclusion, and we started facing, some of these issues. You mentioned the Me Too movement and Black Lives Matter. So I do think that, 2020 was an opportunity to grieve and to start to even think about how do we begin to heal, right? So, now that we're in 2021, there's a lot of pressure to be better than we were, just a year ago, or just a few months ago. But I'm optimistic because I do think that, we learned a lot in 2020. We were forced to question a lot of our values, a lot of our truths. even a lot of, held beliefs and networks, right? So now that we've said, okay, maybe this was not the best way, maybe I have to rethink this, and maybe we need to start thinking about this differently. How do we execute and implement different strategies, right? We can all do that. And certainly, we're talking about tech and fintech. There's so many ways that, as we look at, one of the things I love to talk about, obviously as a woman of color, is that, with the first female vice president, this is going to be the decade of women. Women played such a role in Biden's win, and women are a key part of this, the economy. But, we've spoken before, women were so negatively impacted by COVID globally, right? When you think even women in the workplace, COVID put a lot of women outside of the workplace for many different reasons. So this decade of women, this new decade of rebirth for our nation, and everyone's talking about Amanda Gorman, the poet from Inauguration, that Mrs. Biden was wonderful enough to identify and bring to the nation. She talked about rebirth, right? She talked about how we don't have to be a perfect nation, and we just have to strive to be better. And so, so I do think, this decade, we need to all look at it as an opportunity to define success, to have some specific goals and to address some of these issues we recognize, and now we acknowledge, and now we want to be part of the solution for. We don't have to fix everything in this decade, but we owe it to the next generation, millennials, but certainly Zoomers, the people in college or younger, to start making better choices and to start doing some of the things that are uncomfortable.
Yeah, we can use the decade to get on the right track and be sure we're on the right track. Last question. If you had one piece of advice for the audience, imagine our audience is full of a lot of people from tech companies. Some of them are in charge of them. What would you advise them if they did just one thing?
Yeah, since we're talking about diversifying tech, which is our topic, I would say to accept that diversity is a problem. I would say everybody's always so defensive and saying, no, we don't have a problem. No, we are doing this. And that's human nature, right? Because we are doing so much and we're thinking, why are you going to hit me over the head? I would tell everybody just to accept the fact that you're not doing enough, right? But what you should be proud of what you have done. We need to do more. And also, if you don't do more, this marketplace will not give you a pass.
When we talked about this in the past, one thing you also said that stayed with me was, you said you have a decade. Think about how to get onto the right track just in that period of time, so that by the end of it, things are really, really different, which I really loved.
Yeah, no, tech companies, this is an important decade for them to have some benchmarks, have some goals.
So Cleve, you're an inspiration to me, I'm sure to the audience. I'm so happy that we got to talk today, and you've given us a lot to think about on how we can really do better.
And as we close, I definitely want to commend you as well. You know, as a leader of your organization, you've actually built coalitions, built networks, bring stakeholders together to talk about some of these issues around gender, around tech, and are taking steps to actually foster collaboration. So, you know, kudos to you for the work that you're doing to be a bridge and to be a change maker.
Well, thank you. And one thing we are doing is convening a global tech sprint on how women have been impacted by COVID and how they can build economic empowerment. And so we're very excited about that. There's interest in it all over the world from women and men. And one of the things we're aiming to have is 75% women, including on the tech teams, and 25% men, because most of these tech sprints are the other way around, 75% men. So thank you for that. And thank you to the audience for spending time with us at South by Southwest. It's been really a privilege and a joy to be with you.
Thank you.